We are looking at what makes a marine protected area effective in this session, and we have three speakers with me here and one online who I'll introduce in a short second. Do we have Renaud joining us? I hope so. Good. Let me just sort of introduce this by saying, obviously Peter and others have been speaking today about the importance of 30 by 30. The Global Biodiversity Framework has set that target, protecting 30% of the ocean and, of course, land by 2030. A huge target, an enormous challenge for all of us, I think, who are engaged in trying to make the ocean a healthier space, not least because the high level of protection that's needed envisages, I think, a huge challenge in and of itself, let alone the larger challenge of trying to get, or the large challenge of trying to get 30% of the ocean itself protected. So it's not by any stretch of the imagination an easy thing to do, let alone finance. And we might talk about that in a while too. And at present, of course, depending on which measures you decide to look at, less than 7 or 8% of the ocean is in fact protected, and less than probably 3% of that, I'm not entirely sure of the very latest figures, less than 3% of that is highly protected, in which human activities are restricted to quite a high degree. That, of course, is, I guess, the focus of what we're trying to talk about now. How do we reach a higher level of protection, and how do we make that level of protection effective? And what are the decision-making processes that go into all of that? So let me introduce our speakers. Cathy Graham, next to me, Director General for Marine Planning and Conservation, Fisheries and Oceans in Canada. Thank you, for joining us, Cathy. Vera Coelho, who is the Deputy Vice President of Oceania and working mainly in the European Union. Emmanuel Gonçalves, who is the Chief Scientist and Board Director at the Oceania Azul Foundation. Welcome, Emmanuel. And online, we have Renaud Depuis de la Grande Rive, excuse my awful French pronunciation, who is the director of the Côte Agathoise MPA. Yes. I do apologize, Renaud, if I'm mangling all of this, and a board member of MedPan Network, which oversees and manages marine protected areas in the Mediterranean. So let's begin, shall we? And let's talk, I think, first of all, about what we all think to be an effective marine protected area. And let's start, Cathy, with Canada, I think, because Canada is a world-leading program of marine protected areas. It wasn't necessarily that 10 years ago, but it is, I think, now. That program, I think, has required a great deal of political buy-in and will to create that. And I wanted to start first with everybody, really, to ask that really important question. It's come up several times. What creates that political buy-in? What is needed to drive that political buy-in to do something like a 30 by 30? Cathy.
Thank you. I think you've touched on a really important point where Canada in the past was at less than 1% protection, and now is at 14.66. And just to put that in perspective for colleagues in the room, that represents approximately 850,000 square kilometers of protection in the three oceans that Canada is graced to actually have on its coasts. And I think to your point around how is it that you can generate political interest, I think one of the things that we learned as part of the process to get now to almost 15% is demonstrating a really thoughtful approach to identifying and thinking through where, in fact, do we need this protection? Why do we need this protection? Demonstrating to the political leaders and masters what it is that we need to protect and what do we anticipate will be the benefits of those protections, but also, more importantly, understanding the social, cultural, and socioeconomic considerations that go into establishing these protected areas. And I think that the efforts to get us to where we are now really highlighted the importance as well to engage the local communities, to be part of the solution building, to be part of the monitoring and the data collection that actually shapes and informs the path forward in terms of not only identifying an area, but moving it through the regulatory process to actually establish a marine protected area. And I think really relying on science, as well as traditional knowledge and local knowledge to help shape and inform where these areas need to be and why they are so important. And I think that really has helped us be able to demonstrate the added value, the importance of being able to do this, and also demonstrating how, with the use of marine spatial planning, that conservation and economic prosperity can coexist. And as an example, in Canada, over the same period, we've actually seen the GDP increase by about 6.8%, which represents about 426,000 jobs and about $52 billion to the Canadian economy. So I think being very judicious about the design, the planning, the implementation, I think has been really critical to our success at generating that political support.
Let me come back to a number of those issues in a while, because they're all really important ones. But just, the leap from 1% of coverage to 14% or 15% of, close to 15% of coverage. I mean, what made the government decide to do that, and what arguments did you put in front of the government to be able to, well, of course, you're part of the government, of course, but what arguments were put in front of the government to do that?
I think it was, we benefited tremendously from the science. Yeah. The science, we were fortunate enough that our department and across government had really inventoried and developed a strong understanding of some of the key areas that genuinely needed to be protected. And we presented that by showcasing the beautiful nature that is there, the benthic features that were very important, but also explaining what would be the trade-offs of not actually pursuing and accomplishing that protection. So I would say science was really critical in supporting the demonstration and also in terms of the decision making. Canada undertakes a very extensive assessment process to understand what activities can continue to occur and which ones cannot, based on the conservation objectives, with the goal of being very tailored in terms of the design and implementation of the protection areas, the marine protected areas.
So, I mean, just to take and pick up that point, Vera, if I could, I mean, we, obviously in Canada, you've seen quite a big leap. In the European Union, there is, I think, a lot of political will around this question, but a bigger challenge in getting most of those implemented, I think. I mean, in the UK, we've also seen recently the Benyon report a couple of years ago that showed effectively most of the MPAs that were created around the UK were also mostly paper parks. So what is it that makes politicians and those that make policy actually change their mind about how effective a marine protected area can or should be?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think it's really coming to the core of the issue of effective MPAs. We all know that that the science has improved a lot, as we just heard. We have a much better understanding of the importance of the ocean for the climate system, for biodiversity, for livelihoods, for everything actually that surrounds us. That has spurred this necessity to have more protection, and also then the political will to announce that we will protect vast swathes of the ocean. And that is all very positive because it indicates that political commitment. But the difficulty happens when conflicting interests then come to play. So once we decide that we are going to protect 30% of the ocean, those that were utilizing parts or all of that 30% may not be immediately on board with the question. This is definitely what we observe in Europe. Europe has a vast maritime area. We have also increased the percentage of areas designated as protected significantly in the last few years. But when the time comes to implement protection measures, we see an actual huge amount of resistance to curbing destructive activities inside MPAs. So we can, of course, envisage a scenario where we have multiple use MPAs, where an MPA is not a sacred space that is exclusionary to everything and everyone. But in Europe, we really see the other side of the spectrum, which is in many MPAs, you still have highly destructive activities such as bottom fishing or even fossil fuel extraction happening in so-called protected areas. So I think this is the challenge now, and we also see in the political discourse and the political developments in Europe recently that this is where the rubber hits the road. We had all the discussions about the European Nature Restoration Law, which came to the core of all these questions. How do we restore nature on land and at sea? How do we rebuild abundance? How do we rebuild these systems, these functions that are so essential to all of us for our lives, for our economies, for our livelihoods? And the reaction was incredibly negative, incredibly vocal. And that kind of saps away the political will, which is so necessary and which we don't have time to rebuild slowly. We are really in this poly-crisis that we need to address urgently, and seeing that resistance from the users creates the concern that we will not be able to move towards effective protection.
I guess European seas as well are heavily used, and they have a lot of human impacts on them, whether it's ocean-related impacts, direct ocean-related impacts, or land-related impacts. I mean, which industries do you feel are the most obstructive in this process? Are we able to put our finger on exactly who is making it challenging?
Well, every industry that is currently using maritime space wants to preserve their access to that maritime space. Emerging industries want to obtain their own space, and in the middle you have also ocean conservation commitments. One issue that we observe in Europe is that we have an obligation to establish maritime spatial plans, for example. There is a European directive that requires all member states to develop this plan, but many member states have not yet fully designated their entire network of MPAs. So we are allocating space to economic activities without yet having protected the habitats and species that we are obliged to protect by European regulation as well. Right. So I think Kathy was mentioning the science as a driver for designations and protections. In Europe, in addition to the science, we have actual legal obligations, regulations, as well as political commitments. So these three should lead us to protect these spaces, but that process tends to be left to the end of the pipe, and we prioritize planning and allocating space for all these competing maritime interests, especially in the current climate where we have a true necessity to decarbonize and therefore have expansion of renewable energy at sea, or we have concerns about food security and sufficiency, and therefore we want to make sure that we have sufficient space for emerging activities like aquaculture. This is all creating a lot of pressure, especially for member states that have smaller maritime areas and that need to concentrate shipping, fishing, aquaculture, energy production, military activities in a small EEZ. We observe that a lot in the North Sea, for example.
I guess this is the challenge, isn't it, with the European conception of blue growth and its management in the context of also conservation needs around marine protected areas. And let's come back to that, because that is a really, I think, how do marine protected areas and marine spatial planning and other area management tools work together to, I hate to use the phrase, but I will, create a win-win for the ocean. But Manuel, can I come on to you? Because I would like to hear, before we talk about the science, and of course science has come up twice from both speakers, but what's your impression of what's happening here in Portugal around marine protected areas and the relationship that they have with, obviously, the process of marine spatial planning that's going on in here in Portugal?
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon to all. Let me maybe start by putting things in context. And the context is the following that science shows us. We live two existential crises today. We don't live normal times. And those two crises are the climate emergency and the species extinction crisis. And so we are losing species, we are losing biodiversity, we are managing a degraded ocean. And this is very important for us to recognize. We have 13% of the ocean intact left, 2/3 with cumulative impacts. And we spent 30 years to protect 3% of the ocean. These are facts.
Yeah.
It will take us 300 years to arrive to 30% if we use the same methods. So we cannot use the same methods,
Yeah.
right? And those methods are the ones that are driven here, which is we are not being able to use the tool that can be transformative in helping us save what's left and restore the ocean, which is marine protection, but we are using it in the wrong way. And that's why we achieved this miserable 3% in 30 years of action. So we need to bring science also with standards. And those standards shows us that if marine protection is to work, these areas need to be fully and highly protected. Because that's where you have the benefits that can then drive the solutions also around the uses and the valuation of that natural capital. Because that's the good news, right? The ocean rebounds if we let it. But if we call a marine protected area some place where we do bottom trawling, that's not a marine protected area. It doesn't follow the standards.
Yeah, okay.
And lots of greenwashing, or if you want to call it blue washing, is happening today because we are calling marine protection things which are not.
Yeah.
And so we are causing this false sense of expectation to society that you have a tool that works, but you're using it in a way that can never work and calling it marine protection. So this is where I think that Oceano Azul Foundation has been working heavily with these standards and bringing those standards into the policy and legal arenas, because that's where governments then can make choices. And for governments, to be honest, they'll have the same cost. Well, two things. One, all governments want the benefit of looking good in saying that they are protecting the ocean. Very few governments want the burden of doing the processes that are going to make people angry about, in some point, the measures that are going to be brought in place. Because to be honest, fisheries is in deep trouble.
Right.
And so if you're bringing areas that are going to stop fisheries, you're going to have reactions. But the cost of inaction is the critical aspect here. So you need to bring all these stakeholders together in structured processes where governments can get behind, but also stakeholders can support.
Are you talking about mainly the scientific standards that are required to identify the right kind of ecologically important and diverse areas that need to be protected, or are you talking about broadly standards that are needed not just in the identification of MPAs or prospective areas, but also the standards that are required in order to be able to apply, how those are implemented? And
exactly. So there are three things which are very important for this to work. One, you need to have a science-based process. And you don't need to wait for 30 more years to have more science. You need to pull all the science that exists today. And the science has brought also lots of areas identified as priorities. You know where the seamounts are, where the abscesses are, where the areas of value in the ocean exist today. And by the way, fishers and users have a lot of additional information that can bring to the process. So that's the second element which is critical, which is to build stakeholder engagement processes that allow you to move forward with conservation. And these processes are very different in coastal systems, or in the offshore, or in the high seas. And that's another element of structure that you need to bring into the conversation, because it's hard to do this in busy coastal areas, and Oceano Azul Foundation has done that as well with the local municipalities, with fishers, showing that these solutions can work. But that's a very different game than doing this in the high seas or doing this in the offshore, where the stakeholders are different, the interests are different, and the way that you build this process are different. And of course, the third element is political leadership. And this political leadership, it's built on these two other elements. So if you bring science, stakeholder engaged structured processes, and political leadership together, you can achieve that. And Oceano Azul Foundation has been working in the Madeira Island, where we've been able to help establish the largest fully protected MPA in the whole North Atlantic. This is the good news. The bad news is it's 2,600 square kilometers. So it's tiny,
Yeah.
but it's the largest, which means that this is possible in these remote areas, but the Azores is doing much more. It's going to protect 30% of their OEZ this year through a process that was structured with all these elements, was government-led, and was supported with science, but engaged the stakeholders in bringing these solutions. So this is possible, this can be done, and it can be done until 2030. But it needs to have all these elements together.
Of course, I've had the great privilege of going down to the Selvagens Islands just off Madeira, which was one of the most extraordinary experiences I've had, but to which thank you to the Portuguese government. Renaud, let's come to you, because you're working at the local level around marine protected areas. You're listening to this discussion. We're saying, obviously, the political will is vital in any of designation of marine protected areas, and particularly reaching the kind of targets that we've got in front of us. You've obviously clearly had at one level a national designation for a marine protected area, but most importantly for you, I think it's the local political will that seems to be important in driving the effectiveness of your marine protected area. Is that the case?
Yeah, for sure. Good afternoon, everyone from south of France. Sorry not to be with you. Yes, I think that I share all what I've been said before. For sure, it's important
Just want to turn the sound up.
To say that we have to act now, quickly, rapidly, because of course we need to protect and manage, may I say, the oceans, and for sure that for me at the local level, in my tiny MPA, as you said, yeah,
I didn't say that. But
everyone. It's important to work with all the stakeholders, but the political will, it's at the basis. If the municipality is not okay with what we want to do in an MPA, it's really tricky. I think we need the support of the political. We need to discuss, and one way is to be in a participatory process with stakeholders, because the mayor and the decision makers is one thing, but the local inhabitants and stakeholders is another. So I think we have tried to work on that way, and as it has been said before, it was in a Natura 2000 process. So as it has been said too, it is an obligatory process to protect some habitats and species, so we did it. But I think that at the very beginning of this story of my MPA, which is a long one because it's more than 20 years ago, it was not the same at all. The political will was really not there. I can tell you that the mayor of today was the same mayor 20 years ago, and it was absolutely not the same process we did have. It has changed a lot since some years. Why? Because I think we have proved that we can work with stakeholders, we can hear them. You're right when you said that it's not the same when you are offshore than when you are in the shore. But don't forget that sometimes, for example, in my MPA, it is a very touristic, a high touristic place in Europe, and we have said 20 years ago, we want to protect because we have to protect it, and because we can protect it. So it has begun like that, and it's also, I think, may I say, an efficient MPA because it's also managed with a team, with finances. I'm talking about the ground. I'm sorry to tell you that, but you can have any MPA you have, a larger and a tiny one if you want, and there are tiny MPAs that doesn't work, that are paper MPAs. If you don't have any team, any finance, and not finance only for projects, it's a question of finance, of financing on the long term, because you need to go at sea, to discuss with everybody, scientific progress. As you have understood, you have said before, you are right. Science process is also the basis of what we have to do in the MPAs at the local level. So that means team, finances. Just to say a headquarter is very important. If you don't have any headquarter, it's very, very difficult to speak with stakeholders, with the public, with public awareness and so on. So it's quite some ideas I want to say. And last thing, it's the problem is also to communicate. Because if you stay in your even small MPA and try to do your job without saying, hey, I think this is a little success story, as I'm talking to you, it will not work at the same in the same way, because political will is listening to that too. I can assure you it's the case in south of France, where I'm working.
Well, I think it's absolutely clear that the key component here is political will, but also what it takes to engage politicians and policymakers around what is important and what science is important, what indeed the economic consequences of it are, how it engages with all of the other marine processes, the area-based planning, etc., that is needed. Can I think in that vein, can I come back to this question, and I think it's a really important one, about minimum protection standards. And Canada, I think, was one of the first countries, wasn't it, or is the first country, I don't know whether others have put those in place, to develop these protection standards. And that's formed the basis of how you identify and manage marine protected areas, and I hope build a kind of effectiveness for those marine protected areas that is needed. So, Kathy, could you just tell us a little bit about, A, the importance of those standards, what they are, how they were developed, and what kind of role they play in the whole process?
Well, yes, I'm happy to. So it started with a cross-country panel where we literally went from community to community and heard from Canadians in terms of what their expectations were with respect to marine protected areas. And what we heard were that there was some key activities, and Vera made reference to them, that people felt that if we're going to be developing marine protected areas and that we don't want them to be paper parks, what are those activities that we will from the outset essentially establish that these activities will not occur in our protected areas moving forward? And those include oil and gas, bottom trawling, mining, also looking to enhance vessel discharge within the MPAs, and also disposal at sea of either types of fill and or any deleterious substances. And I think one of the interesting reactions that we've received from industry was a thank you for being clear and providing that clarity.
Yeah.
And one of the other things that we've done to help with that is to provide information to everyone around what is Canada's pathway to get to the 25 by 25 target, because we have an interim one to make sure that we get to 2030, 30% by 2030. And that was actually to be transparent around where are the areas of interest that we are working on with our partners to be able to advance marine protected areas. So I think that has helped industry understand what are those pieces of real estate within the ocean space that they can already plan and anticipate that there's a likelihood that these activities will no longer be occurring within those spaces.
How, Vera, can you just sort of tell us a little bit about what the European Union is thinking about in relation to this kind of standard? Because I think it's deeply important, isn't it, to set the parameters of potential activity or not, as the case may be, in ocean spaces.
In the European Union, there is guidance from the European Commission on what kind of activities are compatible with protection of Natura 2000 areas. There's also, for example, a risk matrix identifying different fishing gears and different habitats and species, and whether certain fishing gears are or are not compatible with those protected species and habitats. However, this is all at the level of guidance, so it is not a legally binding standard that member states must comply with. There's also, of course, international standards like those developed by the IUCN that some member states could use to develop the management plans for their protected areas. I think in Europe we have two fundamental problems, or in the European Union, I should say. One of them is that the protection and designation of the areas is a competence of the member states. So they need to identify the species and habitats, they need to designate the area, and then they have 6 years to develop a management plan. Which is a long, long time, and yet many member states do not meet that deadline. The second problem is that for specific activities such as fisheries, that is then regulated at European level. And there again, we see a bit of a block because when we tried to make the case that there should just be a standard at European level that says inside MPAs, destructive bottom fishing doesn't happen. Yeah. And this is common sense, and indeed if you ask communities even, or people on the street, they will tell you this. This is something that the European Commission considered. They published an action plan where they said, in future, this should indeed be the case, that we do not have destructive fishing inside marine protected areas. And the reaction was extreme. There was actual physical violence against government buildings in France once something so commonsensical was said. Yeah. So I think we still have a lot of work to do at the European Union level to establish these kinds of standards for fishing, which is regulated at European level, and then for other human activities at sea, at each member state level, to have this kind of standard of we do not do mining or fossil fuel extraction or other damaging activities inside our protected areas.
Is that the reason, is this pushback the reason why politically it's been very difficult for a minimum set of standards to be established across the European Union? Is that the main reason, do you feel, or is it?
Yes, because it does mean then having an impact on people's livelihoods and on their day-to-day activities. So you have a set of stakeholders who are legally operating in this maritime space, who have built their businesses and their livelihoods around this activity, who perhaps have not been involved from the start in the designation and management of the areas, and who feel confronted with an imposition from above: you shall now not operate in this way or in this area. Of course, the negative reaction is understandable. I think what we need to think about collectively is how do we support these communities through a just transition towards more sustainable methods of fishing, because bottom trawling is also expensive. It's usually fuel intensive. So we are asking people to have very little profit margins because they have to pay a lot for their fuel to get their fish catch. It's destructive, so it is depleting the fish stocks. We could give them better livelihoods with more fish catch if we actually protected these nursery and spawning areas and these essential habitats. But there is an opportunity cost, so that there will be a short-term impact on those activities in order to have the long-term benefit of having a more abundant ocean. So how do we support these communities during that time gap? How do we support communities in transitioning towards more sustainable forms of fishing? That is the key question, and that is the question that often doesn't get discussed. It's all presented as a binary between protection and regulation and livelihoods and jobs, and it shouldn't be.
Kathy, can I come back to you on that same question? Because, of course, those the right level of restrictions is always a point of haggling, effectively, political haggling. And how did Canada experience that process? And to what extent are the minimum protection restrictions that you have there, standards rather, to what extent are they binding, and to what extent were they negotiated with the various communities that need to be involved in the decision making?
Yeah, so for all the marine protected areas that are in the works right now to be able to get to our interim domestic target, what I would say is we have to engage industry. Yeah. They absolutely have to be part of that conversation. They need to work with us to understand why are we looking at this area, what are the trade-offs, and be part of that conversation. And the objective is for us is that the regulations will essentially prohibit these activities. Yeah. But I would say, to Vera's point, the conversations, you have to start at the design level to actually bring them into the fold and have those conversations. It's really critical. Yeah. It doesn't mean that it's all been roses along the way. We've had some challenges. There's been some marine protected areas that have had to come to a screeching halt in terms of the development so we could have more time to work with our stakeholders. But I do feel that in general, the industry within Canada, once we sit down and roll up our sleeves and start thinking through what we need to protect and why, that they've been very collaborative in terms of helping us get there.
The other thing, of course, the other dimension in Canada is the indigenous population, the First Nations peoples in Canada, and their inclusion in the discussion, inclusion in the process, and their knowledge, their base of understanding of the marine areas that they've lived in and worked in for generations. How, I mean, before we throw this to the audience, how important is that? Because a lot of those marine protected areas are in areas where First Nations people have long lived. How important is that process?
It's critical.
Yeah.
So much so that our Prime Minister announced at COP15 at the CBD in Montreal that we were going to be investing $800 million to advance 4 project financing for permanences in Canada.
Yeah.
And that is really in recognizing the Indigenous leadership and Inuit leadership that we have in Canada, who have for millennia been amazing stewards of our coastlines. And as a result of that, we're expected to deliver Canada's 4 project financing for permanence for 2025. So very ambitious timelines, and the Indigenous and Inuit communities with whom we're working and collaborating with are really instrumental in bringing these to fruition. And I think for us, it's also an important opportunity to work through reconciliation with our First Nations and Inuit partners, to be able to have found an area of common interest that we see in the space of conservation, and they're genuinely being amazing partners in helping us advance our targets.
Well, look, I'm determined not to do what I did last time, and that is not allow any questions. Can I open the floor to any thoughts or questions to the panelists, please? Yes.
Yes, please. Oh, hi, hello. Thank you very much for the panorama of the situation in different areas, but I would like to answer a question to Mr. Emmanuel. We had recently the good news about the Pedra do Algarve, the Recife that is now a marine protected area. Could you please explain in a few words how the process went so well? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think it's a good example on how, if you bridge all these 3 things that we're talking about, science-led, stakeholder engaged, and government engaged also processes, how things can work. So actually it was a bottom-up process that the fishing community initiated, because there is this amazing area that most people didn't know about in the Algarve, the largest reef. And the fisheries had lost 60%, that's 60, in the last 20 years in the Algarve. So fishers are in trouble, and they come up and approached us to try to do something. And so we work with the municipalities, with the Algarve University, to understand what studies are there, with the municipalities to engage with the community, and we build this structured approach where we maximize the conservation benefits and we minimize the impacts on fishing on the solutions. And the solutions are co-designed with the community and then are brought to the government for decision-making already with all these elements. And then the governments, of course, need to do a very important thing, by the way, which is they need to spend money. They need to pay for the costs of implementation. And if fishers are going to stop fishing, they need to have a solution for the next day when these measures are in place. And by the way, this is very, very cheap for society. So if you build all these elements together, if you have science, if you have participation, if you have leadership, and if you have the financial instruments ready, then this is possible. And now the community is behind this area. This area is starting to do all the management plans and implementation, and we also promoted, and the government is still to decide, a co-management mechanism for the implementation in moving forward, where of course the users are the best, let's say, instruments that governments have to make sure that the rules are respected. And this is how you get buy-in, because it's not fair for one group to stop conservation, but it's not fair for one group to pay the costs of that conservation. And this is where we know how to do this, we know what can work, and thank you for bringing that example of Algarve, because I think it's one that actually, by the way, 3 more municipalities right now are implementing here near Lisbon, and we believe it's a model that can be scaled up and it can be replicated in any geographies if you bring this structured approach. And in 18 months, you have legal designation ready for governments to move forward with these structured elements of meetings, science, the legal frameworks, the economics behind it, and then the identification of what is at stake and how to fund that.
Thank you. There's another question over there. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. João Macedo with Hope Zones Foundation. This is a question for Professor Manuel, but hopefully the other speakers also. There's a Portuguese satellite that was launched, and we're all very proud of that, but that will help the fiscalization of these MPAs. And maybe just a couple of examples when it's community-led that the fiscalization is internal. But are there other case studies or examples that you're aware of, or is the satellite already being part of this fiscalization movement that we need to put in place to make sure that the MPAs are protected?
Well, very shortly, on surveillance, we have the tools today to do it, right? On coastal systems, we can do it with cell phones. On the offshore, you can do it with satellites or other instruments. So we have eyes on the ocean now, which was not the case a few years ago or a few decades ago. And so that's not a reason why, again, for not establishing these areas and for not enforce them effectively. Of course, you need also the legal frameworks to follow so that you're able to go after the illegal activities and the ones that don't follow the rules. But again, if you have, in the coastal systems, if you have a community which is engaged, that community is going to be the best tool for you to make sure that the rules are followed.
We have a question in the middle here. Yes, please. Thank you.
Also to Mr. Gonsalves. I am from the Azores.
Are you sure this can't apply to everybody?
I am from the Azores, and you're talking about increasing the areas to 30% by 2030. And I'm wondering how you want to survey these areas. Because at the moment we have these little tiny kind of protected areas in the Azores, but you're not able to survey because there are documented violations. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering how you want to then survey 30%. Mm-hmm.
Well, again, with the same tools. So what you need is to bring all these tools to the process so that governments are able then to have eyes on the ocean and to make sure that the rules are followed. But I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, but one more question over there. I think we have time for one more. Yeah.
Hello. I just wanted to ask a quick question because, it's taking so long for us to implement those measures, to take those commitments, put them in place. But then we've seen the example of Palau that after the pandemic and once they had a financial crisis, they opened a discussion to having to explore their MPA areas again. So how set in stone are those commitments to make sure that we don't take 2 steps back and open those areas again?
Who would like to jump in on that?
Well, I guess from a Canadian perspective that I can speak to, we go through a very rigorous regulatory process, and to undo that takes a lot of time and energy. So we can't foresee what future governments will anticipate or want to do, but I think, the process is just very challenging to kind of work back in time. But I think that we have develop mechanisms to be able to tell the story for all of our marine protected areas in terms of what are the benefits that we're seeing, how are things changing. So I think that really bolsters the need to keep them in place, is to tell that story.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yes, to reflect that, I think we need to do a better job of telling the success stories, because marine protected areas work, and as Emmanuel was saying, the highest the level of protection, the better they work. The longer they are in place, the better they work, and the more the benefits accrue. So we need to collect those data, tell those stories, and make that case that going back is really not an option. We need better protection in face of all the crises that we face, and it works. And I'm actually, I know that Renault, for example, has good examples with his own MPA and the fishers in the area deciding to create a strict protection zone because they know that that is going to help them ultimately. And that is the kind of lesson learned and story that we need to bring out in these discussions.
Well, I think that's a really nice place to end, because telling and talking about the success story is something that we're going to be talking a little bit about later this afternoon. We've just done a report that looks at some of those success stories. Is absolutely vital if we're going to get more buy-in and if we're going to have any chance of reaching these very, very, very ambitious goals. But let me just thank everybody who's been part of this discussion: Kathy Graham, Emmanuel Gonzalez, and Vera Koller, and also Renard. I'm sorry, we haven't got another question for you, Renard, but many thanks indeed for joining us in France. Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you.